Welcome back. Thank you for joining us for this next portion of our maybe overly heady podcast, talking about some of the themes of our book. So today we wanted to answer some more questions and specifically talk about some of the themes regarding religion in our book and some of the dangers of world building with religion and some of our thoughts and how we got to the point in our story with religion in general and our depictions of it, the characters that follow each of the religions. And so I just wanted to start us off, first of all, talking about world building religions in general. Most of you have probably read a number of fantasy series out there. There are some spectacular world builders in multiple series. Some of them I admire greatly. I did find that world building religions was kind of either an afterthought or not particularly deep. When I look at our world, religion plays a huge part in our world and has in world history. And so we wanted to create a world that was a lot like our world, where there were deep-seated religions throughout society. And so it was important to us that we took that part of world building seriously, that we gave it due thought, that we spelled out for our readers what some of the beliefs were so that they made sense, and that we showed people following those religions sincerely. It was a big goal of ours to be able to show our characters in their beliefs, following their religion.
So
thoughts on that, Todd?
Well, let me ask you this: why do you think so many sci-fi fantasy authors steer clear of making religion a central theme of their writing? What accounts for that fact?
I don't want to speak for any other author. I've never talked to another author about this that most would know, anyways.
Yeah, we're just speculating.
I think in a lot of ways, religion's a little bit of a dangerous or touchy subject. Religion, having a religious discussion in our world carries a lot of baggage.
On Earth, you mean?
Yes, thank you. Most people have deep-seated religious beliefs. They can get very defensive when we have discussions about religion, which is unfortunate, but it's a fact. I think we would be remiss to think we could just do this blindly without any repercussions. And so I think a lot of fantasy authors have looked at religion and taken a bit of a hands-off approach. It exists. It's part of the world. It's not a really big thing in the world, or it's vague, and they don't have to define it that way. In many ways, they make religion mystical or cult-like, and they can make it part of maybe the antagonist, that religion is often something the antagonist is using to get their end goals. There are cases where I think that fantasy authors have depicted religion positively, but they're fewer and further between. In most cases, religion in general is a negative force in most fantasy settings, and I think that's because in our world today, it's a little bit non-PC to talk about religion. Yeah. I got to start using Earth and Baon or the Ultideic Prophecies.
Yeah. So I think there's maybe a couple of other things going on as well, and this may be a bit of a controversial take, but I think that most, at least Western society authors who are brought up in Western society, tend to fall in one of two camps personally, right? Mm-hmm. Either they're from a Judeo-Christian or an Abrahamic, certainly, religious tradition, or they're from no religious tradition, either agnostic or atheist. And for those who tend to be religious in their own personal lives, their writing tends to be either through allegory / metaphor, or even more explicitly, religious in its orientation. And I'm going to say Christian for the moment, because I think most of the work I'm familiar with in fantasy in particular that explicitly incorporates religious themes are Christian in their orientation. And so putting Christian themes explicitly into your fantasy writing tends to make it more Christian fantasy, and not
and it can alienate those that don't hold the same values or the Christian faith that the author
that can be
has.
off-putting.
I think we've seen that with
people.
some authors.
That's right.
I think that's true.
And then going the other direction, you've got many other authors who are atheist / agnostic. I'm just going to say atheist for the moment, to simplify. So you've got the atheist group who don't believe personally in earthly religious traditions, or Christianity in particular, let's say, and therefore when it comes to their fantasy writing, they tend to put their own views of earthly religion, which tend to be negative, critical, skeptical, those kind of things, and reflect those approaches in their writing. And when we were approaching how to do religion, how we wanted to reflect religion, we started off on the former camp, I think, initially wanting to be Christian in our orientation, but realized there were a lot of downsides, and that wasn't in fact the experience that we wanted to give readers. And so we steered away from that, but we think there's a lot of depth that can come through showing fictitious religions in the fantasy setting. It doesn't, but without being tied to any earthly religion, but dealing with the religious themes that being the human experience is for both believers and non-believers, but in a world that is deeply religious, like Earth is. And so, go ahead.
Having read a lot of authors that, or gotten to know some authors, read about them, I should say, that have fantasy series, but they are Christian in their own beliefs, in their home life, they still end up showing us a picture of religion that is more like you just described with the atheist or agnostic crowd. And I think probably some of that is due to the fact that as somebody who is religious, I'm used to seeing depictions of religion a certain way, maybe disparaging in some ways. And we're more comfortable dealing with that than making someone else who isn't comfortable with religion dealing with a religious text.
Yeah.
So I think in many ways, some of the authors that I've read, I recognize that they have Christian values, but they're not always evident in their writing. Their writing tends to be more from an agnostic view, even though they aren't agnostic themselves. And I think it's just because that's the depiction that we see in today's media. But I think it's a missed opportunity, though. One of the things I love about fantasy and science fiction is the ability to deal with really complex moral and ethical situations in a neutral setting. So fantasy gives you the chance to have a whole new world.
Or maybe not, just really quickly, maybe not neutral, but without the emotional and psychological baggage that talking about explicitly earthly religions carries with it.
I think that's accurate. You know, when we have religious discussions on Earth, there is a lot of baggage that comes with it. But if we translate those religions to a different setting, like we've done on Baon, then it's a little bit easier for us to have conversations about religious philosophies, because it's not tied to a religion. We don't necessarily get defensive. Now, I can see a reader getting defensive thinking, well, that depiction is a lot like my religion. Are they saying my religion is X, Y, or Z? And we can get into that a little bit later. I think we were careful to try not to depict any religion that we have on earth, but instead focus on the teachings and philosophies behind those religions. And there's so much overlap that I think you'd be hard pressed to fit one in any camp. That's something I love about fantasy.
I agree, and I will say also that we tried very hard to have representations, because there is, to be fair, a lot you can criticize about religion on Earth. As religion has played out through human history, people have done terrible things in the name of religion.
And many good things.
And many good things. So there is both.
You have a huge mix of both.
That's right. Because you have a huge mix of people with there are good people and there are bad people. And no matter what the system is, whether it's politics, economics, it doesn't matter what the system is. There are monsters and there are heroes in every system. Mm-hmm. And to ascribe to the system the characteristics of the people who play out that system in the world is a fair analysis to maybe undergo. Like, you could say, does this system tend to produce more monsters or more angels, right?
Yeah.
And that's a fair question to ask. But I haven't seen any persuasive argument that any religious system is prone to produce more monsters than angels. I think, and this is my own worldview, maybe tainting that somewhat, and I always try to be careful of this. My view of human nature is that it tends to be, on balance, good. And there are certainly times
I would agree
where everyone has tendencies to behaviors that are harmful to themselves and to other people. But I think almost everyone has also tendencies towards the good. And on balance, I think in the world, there's more good than bad. Now, do
you think that living in another society, outside of your home in the United States, you went and lived in another culture, do you think that shaped that view?
I think I had that view from a very early age. Like, as a result, I was very trusting in the world, which made me naive and gullible. That explains a great many things. I've always defaulted in my disposition toward believing the best of people. There have been some rough knocks in life where I've seen people treating me badly. And that has helped make me more open-eyed, more realistic about human nature. But I've never lost the belief that, on balance, humanity is mostly good. And
that's awesome.
But there have been some monsters who do terrible things. So a huge amount of suffering and pain does exist in the world. I think it tends to be caused by a very small minority of people who tend to do extremely evil things, harmful things to other people. And that makes the world appear to be maybe more evenly split between good and evil. When it comes to people, I don't think that's true. When it comes to suffering versus benefit in the world, maybe that's a little more true, but I just think a disproportionate amount of the suffering comes from a relatively small minority of people. And I'm sure there are people who disagree with me about that. But that's my own.
Well, it's interesting. We kind of reached the same conclusion, but we went about it through different means. I was a little bit more skeptical of people and motivations growing up. I remembered thinking, I grew up in the Cold War. I remembered being somewhat distrustful that the other side was acting in good faith. I didn't know people from the other side. I was a little bit isolated in my world. And so I tended to be a little bit distrusting. When I went and lived in Sweden, which was a neutral country at that time, I met lots of people from other cultures. And what struck me during that time was how similar we were. You know, the same things made them happy, the same things made them heartbroken. They were dealing with the same troubles. And I just realized everyone out there is just like us. Everyone out there in general is good, trying to do good. And I agree with you. I think there's kind of a 90-10 rule. 90% of the bad in the world is done by 10% of the.
Yeah.
It's probably a far more of a disparity than that. But most people in general are trying to do good and trying to be okay citizens of the world. And I think it's interesting you reach the same conclusion.
Yeah. So how do you think that is played out in the way that we depict religion in our world, and not the religions themselves, but the way people manifest, order their lives in accordance with religion in our world based on our views of human nature?
Well, one of the things that I think became important to both of us, I know certainly it's been something that's I've held close to my heart, is trying to show sincere depictions of each religion, having somebody in the story that can cast a religion in a positive light, so that we're not showing one is the good guys and one is the bad guys.
Right.
And instead showing people sincerely trying to follow. And even though as the story progresses, the reader might be uncomfortable with the actions of some members of religions. Not to get into too many spoilers, but in Samet's scene, for instance, she commits atrocities. Those are the horrible things that we see in our world being committed from time to time. Nofit has to deal with the fact that somebody of his own faith committed those atrocities. But does he stop? Does he cease his own faith? Or does he carry on with the beliefs that he's always held, knowing that she went too far, but that doesn't mean my religion is false? And I think that as the story progresses, you'll see more and more of those kinds of depictions where we try to show people struggling with their own beliefs, but sincerely believing them and following up on those beliefs, acting on those sincere beliefs. Not everybody is depicted as being faithful at all, but when we show those things, to me, it's very important that we're showing the sincere following of their beliefs, and their actions reflect that.
Yeah, and does
that answer what you were?
Yes, and it leads me to some additional complexity with religion generally, whether we're talking about on Earth or on Baon, because it is tempting when we're analyzing religions, again, whether we're talking about Earth or in a fantasy setting, to create a monolithic belief system and call it, religion X. And the problem is that there are as many versions of that religion as there are believers in that religion. Like you and I don't view our religion, even though we, we have differences. We're members of the same religion. We don't always see eye to eye on what our religion teaches or believes, or what we believe. And you and I are very similar, even for being, members of the same faith. You and I, even though we're very similar, we don't see eye to eye, let alone a number of other people in our own faith who see things differently, let alone expand to Christianity more broadly, or Judeo-Christian Christianity more broadly, or just, what. So in our depiction of religion, no one in our religion is the definitive authority on what that religion is or means. And even any one person can have inconsistent views about their own religious beliefs, or or what a particular religion, because most people hold inconsistent beliefs in whatever it is they believe in, even apart from religion. If you believe in a moral philosophy, you almost certainly hold inconsistent views within that philosophical moral system. It's just part of being human nature. Is your belief in a system tends to be reverse engineered from not a random set, but maybe not a perfectly rationalized and coherent and consistent set of moral principles, you tend to
Yeah.
believe like we shouldn't hurt people. But then you might say, except in these circumstances. There are very few people who would say, under no circumstance at all whatsoever should we ever hurt anyone. And as soon as
Right.
you move off of absolute, an absolute belief, which most people don't have, even if they even if they say they do, they really don't, because you push them on hypotheticals and then they realize, okay, well, maybe that's an exception. And as soon as you break that sort of perfect barrier, you're going to be introducing things that lead to contradiction. And so in our story, when dealing with fantasy, part of what makes our book complex, and maybe for a lot of readers too complex, I don't know if people will end up enjoying this, but for you and I as authors, we wanted to show the complexity in a theological sense of any one individual holding inconsistent views, different people within a religion holding different views, people from outside the religion, their view of a religion may be inconsistent with people inside that religion, and that's only when you get to the intellectual analysis. When you get to the way that it's lived day to day in people's lives, people behave inconsistently with their own conscious moral beliefs all the time.
It's human nature.
It's human nature. And it leads people to have feelings about themselves or in judging other people. Oh, that's hypocritical, right? Because you profess to believe this, but you don't live it. That is everybody. There is nobody on this planet who lives 100% perfectly consistent with their moral principles, unless your moral principle is, I have no moral principles and I just do whatever I feel like in the moment. Okay, if that's your moral system, fine, then you're maybe the one exception, but almost.
Yeah, I would still question that.
Probably, because they probably
that gets into a whole philosophical, exactly.
So religion is messy because people are messy. Human existence is messy from an intellectual and moral and emotional and behavioral and psychological perspective. We are a mess. We are complex. And reflecting that in any way that's accurate in the book leads to a lot of complexity.
It's funny. We, as Christians, we believe there was one person that was able to accomplish that. And all Christians are trying to model themselves off of that one person with no hope of ever measuring up.
We will always fall short.
Right, exactly. And so, I think that did make us pretty hesitant in the beginning, and knowing that this wouldn't be for everybody, and there would be some people that would find it off-putting and things like that. Do you want to talk a little bit about our hesitancy to go this route, and what made us eventually decide to lean into world building rather than bury the lead a little bit, and kind of downplay our religious themes?
So let me describe the writing process and a couple of the drafts, and then why don't you get into more of the why?
Yeah.
So when we did our first draft, we had way less religion in the draft. You already mentioned the Tarsopta chapters with Nafed and Samet. Those didn't exist in the first draft. We added those later because we said that those religious themes are not as prevalent, and we wrestled a lot with it. So then we added those in. Those were some of the early chapters where we said, let's start putting in more of the religion. Some of the early chapters, while they're still in Terrace with Andric and Beric, and Shirin was not a character in the original draft of the book. That the religious attacks going on in Terrace and elsewhere were barely mentioned, certainly not depicted, and many of the chapters with Shirala's religious experiences throughout the book did not exist. So when we first wrote, there was hardly any of that, and we had to really conscientiously go in and add entirely new sections, chapters of the book to depict some of these religious themes, to deal with it. I will say part of the reason we wanted to do that was because where the book ends up going, was going to be very difficult if we took it was going to be
Yes.
difficult to get the readers the experience in the book that they needed to have in order for that to make sense and be impactful.
Yeah.
We needed to start the themes earlier, but then also we realized the purpose of us writing the books isn't being realized if we totally sidestep discussion of religion.
Yeah, I think it would have been disingenuous of us to proceed without trying to bury the lead on some of the religious themes. We wanted to tell a story about a struggle on the world of Baon between the gods and between their worshippers, and what philosophy would ultimately lead to the greatest happiness, and we couldn't do that if we kept hiding all of the religious things. I think in the beginning we were a little hesitant because we wanted to make a book for everyone. We wanted to we were trying to play it safe, and I think you're right. We ended up being disingenuous to our own story and our own characters if we kept hiding these things. And so if we wanted to tell a story of a world in religious turmoil, among other things, we needed to show that turmoil. And if we had characters that had beliefs, it was dishonest to hide those beliefs. They governed a lot of the things the characters thought and were doing, and I think it was important that we depicted it with integrity.
Yeah, another thing also, as we grew as writers, was we were really focused initially as young, inexperienced writers. Maybe someone like Brandon Sanderson would hear that and just laugh, like, oh, that's so cute. You guys are still young and inexperienced writers. But
I think that's accurate.
But when we were really new at this, we were really focused on just plot. Like, what are cool things to have happen in the book? How should the characters fight? How should we make exciting things happen in the book?
Yeah.
We did not understand.
Here's 7 cool scenes. How can we string them together to make a cohesive story?
Yeah, exactly. And so we were very plot driven, not character driven. There were very little stakes built into it, either internal for the characters individually or in the world. It just felt empty and sort of void of those stakes. And as we learned the techniques of writing, we realized that a lot of the drama, a lot of the stakes, a lot of the subtext for things that we wanted people to pick up in our writing, you can't get subtext if you're missing any clues to how to interpret a scene.
If you have no text.
Where you're missing the context, to be able to pick up on the subtext. So for us, it became, we realized that writing about the religious themes in our book was not only important to be true to why we were writing the books, but they were really useful as writing techniques to make the book interesting and to give people the opportunity to have it be meaningful for themselves, to connect with the characters, because it matters deeply to the characters, whether they realize it or not. Like, we have characters, let's say, for example, Corian. Because of his background, he eschews any fidelity to any of the gods. He is somewhat disgusted with the
way the struggle has played out in his life and in the world.
He's disgusted with religious people generally, like the influence that the god's existence has in the way people live their lives. He's opposed to that generally. And so he tries not to follow any of the gods. Like, consciously, he's like, I won't worship any god. The ironic thing is that's a fairly widespread phenomenon. And that's what keeps one of the gods, Akrahar, in play, is Akrahar teaches you should have no higher authority than yourself, including him. Akrahar's like, don't worship me. Don't worship any of the gods. Don't give up your agency or your liberty or whatever, your freedom, to any other authority, earthly or in, celestial. You are your own highest authority, period. And Quarian lives that even better than a lot of people who do like profess to follow Akrahar, because they follow Akrahar against Akrahar's teaching that they shouldn't even follow him. Quarian's one of the few believers who follows that.
Yet at the same time, I think you could see in Quarian's behavior and in his motivations that he also follows others. And, I think over time, especially as the readers learn more about Quarian, they can kind of see how he got to this point, but see that he's on a journey and that no one is all one or the other religion. And that's actually part of what I had hoped to create, is an environment where, again, I mentioned fantasy as a kind of a safe space for talking about religion, because we can make a neutral ground in Baon where people could maybe identify themselves. Hey, my hope is somebody looks at our work and says, I'd like to think I'm Dorothi and Viancian, but I'm probably a little bit Psychorian in some of the things that I do as well. I'd like for people to be able to look at that and see their own actions and motivations as they would play out in that world. And that gives you a chance to have a discussion about, what are your motivations? Where would you fall? Why is this healthy and this not? As opposed to, if we were to have the same discussion on Earth, and it often gets tied up into the religious baggage that plagues society right now.
Just a brief interruption to let you know that our new book, The Storm Beneath the Glass, will be available April 8th, and we'll leave links down below where you can find it on Amazon or on our website. Now we'll get back to the content. So I think it would also be maybe worthwhile to take a few minutes to talk about, we've talked about this in other videos, but how did we come up with the gods? Who are the gods? And how does religion and faith, what does faith even mean in a world like ours where the gods are fully understood to exist? Like, it's not a question on Earth where does any god exist? If so, or how many gods exist? There's at least in my
not to the same extent, anyways.
In my social media feed, there's this video pops up fairly often of Ricky Gervais with an interview that he did, an appearance on Stephen Colbert's show, The Tonight Show, and they were having a discussion about the fact that Ricky is atheist and Stephen is Catholic, I believe. He's Christian, certainly. I think he's Catholic. But they were having a discussion about it, and Ricky said, there have been 3,000 gods throughout human history, roughly speaking. You don't believe, talking to Stephen, you don't believe in 2,999 of them.
999.
And I just don't believe in one more than you, right? Like that's, and Stephen was like, that's a fair argument about this thing. So in our fantasy world, we don't have that phenomenon. We've completely sidestepped the question of, do the gods exist? There is not an active discussion or a question in most people's minds. Do the gods exist or not? There's too much evidence. The power, the magic system, the divinessence system from the gods and their involvement in the world is too powerful of evidence that they exist. So
I think any skeptics that at this point question whether or not there are entities that are granting these powers through benefactions, I think any of those are very, very minor, and the bigger majority are those that don't care.
Well, I mean, you can summon celestial creatures from the realms of the gods. Like, there's just no real basis for believing that the gods might not exist. Everyone knows effectively that they exist.
Most people wouldn't have seen summoning, but at the same time, there is evidence. We realized if we were going to show priestly powers, if we were going to show a magic system that's based on the divine, then what we were really depicting was a world that faith was not as important because there were signs, there was evidence. So there was knowledge rather than just faith.
Well,
it's not that faith wasn't important.
So we should define terms
that,
here, because faith gets used to mean two different concepts.
True.
What there one concept of faith, and this is very Christian in its orientation, is a belief, and this is taking from the letters of St. Paul. Faith is a belief in things that are not seen, but that there is some evidence that they're true, right? But not enough evidence that you know that they're true. So it's this sort of invisible, unknown, or not known with any certainty entity, and you order your life according to the partial evidence that you find through your faith, through your experience. That's one concept of faith. People also use faith to simply mean the religious system or moral system by which they live their lives.
True.
And so to be very clear about how we're using the term in this case, we mean the former. When we say that faith doesn't exist on Baon, it means that the belief in gods that may or may not exist, and you're going off of very limited or no evidence for the gods, that doesn't exist. So faith doesn't, in that kind of definition, doesn't exist. The kind of faith that colloquially a lot of other people use to mean people who live out a religious belief system or a moral belief system, that absolutely does exist in Baon. It exists everywhere. Most people live by that system.
But at the same time, the former view of faith, where you're believing in something that it isn't proven, but is true, or you believe it to be true, that changes when you have signs. I mean, if everyone who converted to Catholicism suddenly won the lottery, you'd get a lot of Catholics.
Right.
It wouldn't require faith because they would see the benefit and they would follow the benefit. That also doesn't require a lot of devotion. And in our setting, that would only mean you're still doing it based on your motivations. So those motivations for following something may not support the God you intended to support. When we created a world, I think it's even worth going way back and say, why did we create a polytheistic world at all?
Yeah.
Why not just do monotheistic, or as I would call it, a duotheistic? Most fantasy settings have a good and a bad side, and it's that struggle between the two. Some of them have sides that are all shades of gray. I think we kind of tend to go towards that there's varying shades in all sides. And part of our goal in the beginning was we wanted to create a polytheistic point of view, and we wanted to have these gods not be, like the Greek, the god of the ocean, the god of this, the god of fertility. We wanted to make it to where they had personalities. And so originally we just came up with these gods and we gave them personalities, likes and dislikes and things like that. But if this was really a struggle between the gods,
remember how
it doesn't work.
Do you remember how we actually came up with the gods originally?
No, go.
So we played D&D.
I'm missing that part.
When we were creating this as we were world building for this to be a game, we wanted to assign a different god to represent the 9 alignments that D&D has, right? Between chaotic, neutral, and lawful, and evil, good, neutral, and good. And so the 9 boxes of alignment that creates, we originally came up with a god to sort of represent each alignment. And
which was really uninteresting.
Really, I mean, not to knock D&D, because their gods do that a lot. They tend to fall in that sort of, kind of a mix between the Greek version and then just, having gods that are, represent the different alignments. That's how we started. But we switched. our thinking evolved, and we came to realize that we wanted to have the gods represent the predominant moral systems that we see on
Yes.
earth, that people live their lives. Again, not religious, moral. And
Yeah.
I'm going to use two examples of our gods and what moral system we think they generally represent. So I'll take the Sharnists, Sharndara, the goddess who espouses essentially utilitarianism. She espouses the highest good is bringing about the most happiness, the most pleasure, the most good for the most people. And if your motive is to bring about the most good for the most people, then you're aligned with Sharndara. And
Right.
the problem, or one of the challenges, as an example, with utilitarianism is that it can lead to some decisions, some behaviors in moral, challenges that are moral dilemmas that are very distasteful to most people. So, like the trolley problem is a classic example when it comes to utilitarianism.
Yes.
I'm not going to go into that. Anyone can look up the trolley problem if they want to, but that's the problem with Sharndara. One of the criticisms of utilitarianism would be that. And so we deal with some of those complexities, but Sharndara effectively represents that. Another example would be Psychoria, who represents essentially the principle of hedonism. Doing what feels good to me is the highest moral good by which to live my life. Now, there's, again, criticisms you could level against being hedonistic.
Right.
What I will say is there are versions of hedonism that, as a moral system, are much more sophisticated and defensible than merely what in any moment, whatever I feel like doing is the highest good. Like that's not, I mean, that's
100%
that's
agree.
the most rudimentary version of hedonism. And so each of the gods represents one of these systems for us, which is why, as you said, it doesn't tie to any religion on earth, because the gods don't represent a religious theological system. They represent a moral way of thinking and being.
And in many ways, what we tried to do was deconstruct the various world religions and say, what are some core values or viewpoints that are carried within today's world religions that we're missing on Baon? And how can we incorporate some of those ideas, some of those philosophies into our
and I would say it's
our
not,
world's religions?
I agree, but I mean, to be fair to us, we didn't just do that with religious systems. We did it with
not at all.
political systems, philosophical systems, like Marxism or capitalism, or
Right.
a multitude of moral systems that play out in the world. And here's one of the key religious or philosophical themes that play out in the book is there is nobody in the world who can avoid having a moral impact on the world. It is not possible to avoid having a moral impact. Not a single soul can live their life without having a moral impact. Now, if you become a recluse, a monk living somewhere by yourself, and you pull yourself out of the world, you will have an influence in the world. Like that is a moral system you're living by, and it will have an influence. And the aggregate across humanity of people living by the same moral system, take again utilitarianism. If 1 billion people are living by utilitarian principles, that's going to have an impact in the world, whether they intend to or not. It's unavoidable. Or if there are 1 billion Marxists or 1 billion capitalists or whatever system,
right,
they will have an influence. And a lot of people are largely unconscious about the influence they're having in the world. Now, you can have an influence through your behavior, that's true. But we believe that the motivation, the moral motive that you live your life by is even more influential, really, in the world.
Yes.
Because in the
Both play a part, but by far their motivation is the driving factor.
yeah, and has the deepest and longest lasting impact in the world, far outlasting any behavior. The moral principles that you live your life by, again, for most people, unfortunately, this is largely unconscious, and will nevertheless, in the aggregate, have a significant impact on the world. And that is what the Ultideic Prophecies are about, is that
Yeah.
the contest of the gods to see in the end of times which of the gods will win, is really the mechanism of having this moral contest between the various systems, which one will gain the most traction, the most influence in the world. And the pendulum swings from time to time, both within individuals, within communities, within the world at large. And not only in time, but across time, across the history of the world, that is playing out and aggregating up in interesting ways. And we play with all of those ideas and themes in the book because we believe that's happening on Earth. We think this same contest of a war between ideologies, between moral systems, is playing out in the world, not just in, say, religious conflict between whatever the Houthis and the who are anyway. I don't want to get too detailed into specific religious conflicts. There's lots of them going around. But taking a step back, between any two ideologies or more ideologies, they're at war with each other for trying to gain influence in the world. And we believe it would be better for humanity if people would be conscientious about that. And be analytical about what the moral systems are. Again, apart from the religious systems, be conscientious about the moral systems by which you could live your life, and then be very conscientious and educated about which moral system you want to align yourself with. And that will be a process, both in learning what the moral systems are, and then trying to instantiate in your behavior the influence of those moral systems that you choose to follow.
It's interesting that I don't know if you remember, we had scenes with the gods at one point. We had written scenes. Yeah, and it was important for us that we wanted to show that the gods aren't perfect. They aren't all-knowing. They have their beliefs, but that they also have their personality. All of that's still true. But I think we realized over time, as we were depicting the gods in scenes, that they were becoming characters, and their moral viewpoint was diluted somewhat by the depiction of them in those scenes. And so we pulled away from having scenes with the gods, creating them as characters, having the reader get to know them as individuals.
By the way, just to clarify,
yeah,
the depictions of the gods were diluting them, not diluting. Okay, right?
Yes.
Is that it took me a minute to figure out what you meant. Yeah, we didn't want to dilute the impact or the opportunity that the reader had to understand in their own sense what it was. Not that the gods are diluted. Although you could argue, and some of the gods would argue that some of the other gods are diluted, or people following religions.
I think
so. It could go.
I think greatly. And I think in many ways, by showing them as characters, while it was fun and interesting, you lost that moral struggle a little bit.
Yeah.
And I think it's better to show them from the standpoint of the characters and their very limited interaction with them, and seeing the evidence of their followers in the world and getting to know the gods that way, instead of getting to see them interact with each other in some heavenly setting that was rather fanciful and kind of fun to write, but took away from the overall meaning of the story. And really, it ended up being part of the stuff that should have and did end up on the cutting floor, because it did not help advance what we were trying to do. It ended up being a little bit of fluff. And while I enjoyed it, and it helped us get to know the gods a little bit better, I don't think it was. In fact, I think it was detrimental to the reader to see them in those scenes.
So, maybe revealing what we hope someday will be one aspect of the interactions fans have with each other, fans have with us, is the idea that people can use the religious framework within the Ultideic Prophecies as a way of having their own moral discussions with each other, or analyzing for themselves. Again,
yeah, kind of a shorthand.
So like in Harry Potter, there was the sorting hat for which house you got assigned to. And we've joked that it would be funny someday if there was like some kind of sorting hat or test you could take that would tell you which religion you which god you most,
which divinessence you're aligned with.
You're aligned with. And while that would be fun, I think the process of having discussions about which system or systems you align with can be useful for helping you become more sensitized and more aware and think more deeply about your own moral systems, and analyzing the moral systems in the world outside of the framework of, are you Christian or not Christian, right? Like that's an important question, and I mean that with respect to every religion. Like, do I believe? Am I a theist or am I an atheist? Those questions, those existential questions, are profound and very important, and deserve their own attention. But alongside that question, and ancillary to it, but an important ancillary aspect is, what are my moral values apart from my religious beliefs? And religion can inform those, but it can also obfuscate sometimes those moral questions of what are the foundational moral beliefs, right? Like this is an ancient question that Greek philosophers and many others have asked when it comes to questions of people's belief in the gods. Is something wrong because the gods have declared it so, or right? Is something right or wrong because God or the gods have declared it right or wrong? Or is it right or wrong regardless of the gods' declaration of where it falls? And if it is only right or wrong based on the God's declaration, or God's declaration of the nature of the thing being considered, then it's capricious and arbitrary.
Right.
If it is good or evil in its own right, then why do you need God to lay that out for you, other than it's a useful bridge between your early stages of moral development and your later stages, your more advanced stages of moral development, where you can maybe outgrow the need for justifying.
It's a classic argument that that is often takes place between theists and non-theists.
But I think that's a useful question.
Yeah.
Regardless of which side you fall on, does God exist or not, whether you're atheist or theist. Let's take a theist, for example. A theist would be well advised not only to say, what does my God or the gods I believe in say about what's right or wrong, but what do I understand is the nature of right or wrong, and how would I answer that if I had to decide without any spiritual direction from a higher authority? There's deep, I believe, value in going through that analysis and that contemplation on your own. And
Well, I think in some ways that's the struggle that's taking place on the earth, is that sorting of, if we follow this, Terethia to the nth degree, or Viance to the end, what does that look like? Does that work?
Right.
What and why?
Yeah.
And so I think what we're ultimately doing is saying, why is this good or evil inherently? What?
Yeah.
Yeah. Not why does somebody declare it to be good or evil, but if followed sincerely, where does this lead?
And
what is the outcome?
Yeah. And so, like, if you take Marxism, for example, why does Marxism fail every time it's tried to be implemented? And the answer is often because I wasn't the one implementing it. Like, if I was in charge, right? But the same thing with capitalism. Why does capitalism lead to abuse every single time? Like, why does it lead to wealth disparity every time?
Because I wasn't in charge of it.
Because I wasn't. If I was, I would be more philanthropic or whatever. Like, no, you like.
Right.
Come on, right? And so every system is susceptible in its, like, taken to the extreme, implemented fully. It seems to run into a point where it breaks down. And even, like Christianity, if you take it zealously, if you become a zealot for Christ, which, depending on what you think that means, it can lead to terrible behavior, like the Inquisitions or the Crusades or whatever, right? So taking a step back, developing the ability and the intuition to take an analytical view of what is right or wrong in principle. Forget, like, me just receiving, like, written on stone tablets. And I'm not trying to, disparage God's, dispensation of the 10 Commandments, but why are those declarations good, or are they good?
Right.
And delving into the nature of the goodness or wrongness of the moral principles in a moral system is the conversation that we're hoping to spark, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that we would have been remiss if we didn't explore those things. That was genuinely part of what we hungered for as writers. I wanted something that delved deeply into humanity, what it means to believe in a higher power, what drives humanity forward, what motivates people, what are good motivations, and what is the nature of good and evil. And I think that much of fantasy talks about this, but there isn't a ton that really dives headfirst into this. And so I always look back at our decision to pivot, and rather than downplay this, to lean into it as a bit of a controversial decision, in that I realize not everybody wants a moral discussion in their fantasy. I get that.
Yep.
But I do think there's a market for it. I do think there are people that enjoy reading something that makes them put it down and go, where do I stand on this? How would I react? I think my hope is that it leads to self-reflection, and it leads to people really analyzing, what am I doing with my life? And like we joked about, where would I fall in this spectrum? Is that good or bad?
Yeah. And I guess the last thing I'll say is we try to steelman as much as possible every moral system, and also show depictions of where that moral system can go off the rails, and leave as much room as possible for, we're not here to preach about what the right answer is on what's the best moral system. We're here to create opportunities for people to consider those questions themselves. And by the end, we will give, maybe the story wraps up with maybe somewhat of an argument on a way to think about those questions, on which one, is there one that's best, and what does that mean? What does that look like? Probably not what people would expect. But again, we're not trying to be preachy about any particular viewpoint.
Right.
We really just want to explore it and see where it leads us. And maybe the end will still vary by the time we get there. I mean, it's varied based on the experiences you and I have had over the last 3 decades.
Yeah. We've mentioned, though, that we've outlined all 7 stories. That doesn't mean it's set in stone. And well, even in the last decade, we've changed where we want the end to go a little bit. And I'm sure by the time we get there, there will be further changes.
Yeah.
But I think it's a valuable conversation to have in the fantasy world, and I especially think now that more readers out there have been introduced to fantasy, we have a chance to kind of bring some thoughtful discussion into the genre, and I don't think that's a bad thing.
Yeah. We'd love to hear from everyone in the comments. If you think that religion in fantasy is a bad idea, if this, if you think we're way off base in any of our thinking, or if you have any questions that we can answer, to other topics you'd love to hear from us about, let us know in the comments. We'll
also let us know what your favorite depiction of religion in fantasy is. I'd be curious to see what you liked or didn't like, if you have one that you really despised.
Unless it's ours, and then just keep it to yourself. No, all right.
And if that's how you feel, thanks for making it through an hour with us. I really appreciate it.
All right. On that note, have a great one. We'll talk to you next time.